"She is little more than a wallflower, a shadow clinging to the edges of the room," the Duke of Alastair murmured, his voice a low, dismissive rumble meant for his companion, but carrying easily to where Lady Eleanor Vance stood. A chill, colder than the January draught sweeping through the ballroom, settled deep in her bones. She felt the familiar heat of shame creep up her neck, but this time something else mingled with it, a cold, hard resolve that was entirely new. He saw a shadow, and for months that was all she had allowed him or anyone to see. It was safer in the dark. From her vantage point behind a potted palm, she watched him, the man who had so casually shattered her world, now holding court at the centre of London society. He turned, a careless laugh on his lips, his gaze sweeping the room before it snagged on her. But she was no longer alone. A hand, firm and reassuring, rested on the small of her back. The man beside her, the enigmatic Mr. Davies, leaned in, his whisper a stark contrast to the Duke's public pronouncement. "Is the lion ready to show his claws?" he asked, his eyes twinkling with a shared secret. Eleanor allowed a small, genuine smile to touch her lips as she took Mr. Davies's arm, stepping out from the shadows and directly into the Duke's line of sight. O primeiro mês naquela pensão apertada e com cheiro de mofo foi enterro. Despojada de sua casa, de seu nome e do futuro que imaginara, Eleanor atingira o fundo do desespero. Os jornais da alta sociedade, outrora repletos de menções à sua família, agora guardavam silêncio. A rejeição do duque ecoava no vácuo silencioso de seu quarto, lembrete constante de sua impotência. Ela passava horas encarando a única janela, suja de respingos de chuva, sentindo-se completamente invisível, fantasma assombrando os confins de mundo que a expulsara. A dor pela perda do pai era uma ferida aberta e viva, agravada pela picada amarga da traição de Alastair. Ela se sentia não apenas com o coração partido, mas totalmente e completamente apagada. The room itself was a character in her tragedy. Her few remaining possessions, a small trunk of plain dresses, a single strand of pearls her mother had left her, and a leather-bound volume of Ovid's Metamorphoses seemed to huddle together for warmth in the stark space. She ran a finger over the pearls' cool, perfect surface before deliberately tucking them into the trunk out of sight. Then she opened the Ovid, its familiar spine cracking a protest, and placed it on the lone windowsill, a small but definite claim on the barren room. Sleep was a fickle ally, and her dreams were a relentless reel of that final, silencing look from Alastair. She would wake with a start, the phantom taste of shame and unshed tears thick in her mouth, the silence of the boarding house a heavier burden than any noise. One such morning, after a night haunted by the echo of her own silenced voice, a new emotion began to pierce the fog of her grief. It was a small hot coal of anger. It ignited when she caught her reflection in the tarnished mirror above the washstand. The face that stared back was pale, shadowed by sleepless nights, but the eyes held a glint she had not seen in weeks. It was not the soft light of love or the dull sheen of despair. It was a spark of pure, undiluted fury. She thought of the letters. Her father's solicitor, a meticulous man named Mr. Davies, had written several times in the months preceding his death. The correspondence was cryptic, hinting at consolidated assets and private ventures that were not reflected in the main ledgers. He'd mentioned a secure location for certain documents. At the time, consumed by her father's illness and then her grief, Eleanor had filed them away as the ramblings of a dying man and an overly cautious lawyer. Now their vague warnings screamed with new significance. Lord Harrington had been so eager, so brutally efficient in acquiring the last of the Vance estate. He had dismissed her father's investments as failed gambles. But what if they weren't? What if the discrepancies she had noted in the ledgers weren't errors, but deliberate obfuscations? The thought was a lightning strike in the dark room. For the first time in a month, Eleanor moved with purpose. She dragged her small trunk from the corner and knelt, her fingers not fumbling but working with a grim certainty. She bypassed the layer of simple muslin dresses and reached for the familiar. worn leather of Ovid. With the resolve born from her grim realization, she opened it directly to the hollowed-out pages and retrieved the small, tight bundle of letters tied with a black ribbon. Mr. Davies's letters. She carried them to the small table by the window, the weak morning light just enough to read by. She smoothed the first page, her eyes scanning the formal script. Your father, ever the visionary, has placed his confidence in a venture separate from the entailed properties. He was most insistent on its confidentiality. Another letter mentioned a partnership, not with a fellow English gentleman, but with a merchant consortium based in Bristol. The final letter, dated just a week before her father's fatal fever, was the most compelling. The documents pertaining to the Bristol endeavour are secured. I have followed his instructions to the letter. They await only the rightful claim. The rightful claim. Her claim. A plan, fragile and audacious, began to form in her mind. It was a mad thing, born of desperation and that newly kindled fire in her soul. She could not go to the new Duke of Ashworth. He was the architect of her ruin. She could not go to the law. As a woman, with no male relative to champion her, her voice would be dismissed as readily as it had been at that dinner party. She was invisible, a ghost. But a ghost could move unseen. A ghost could listen at keyholes and slip through cracks in the world. She would have to become someone else entirely. Eleanor Vance, the well-bred lady, the Duke's forsaken ward, was a liability. That girl had been too trusting, too soft. She needed a new name, a new story, and a position that would grant her access to the world of men and their documents. She thought of the bustling docks of Bristol, a world away from the glittering ballrooms of London. A place where a woman of intelligence, willing to trade on her wits rather than her pedigree, might find a foothold. Looking around the dismal room, she no longer saw a tomb. She saw a chrysalis. The grief was still there, a cold stone in her chest, but it was now encased in a shell of hardened resolve. The betrayal had not broken her. It had forged her into something new, something sharper. Alistair and his cousins had wanted her silent and erased. They had underestimated the woman reciting Ovid in the original Latin, the one who managed ledgers with a mind sharper than any clerk. They had dismissed her as a flight of fancy. She would show them just how real a flight of fancy could be. The ghost was ready to walk. Driven by her newfound resolve, Eleanor finally knelt before the small trunk from her father's old study, the steady drum of rain against the window, a dull accompaniment to the ache in her heart. For weeks it had sat in the corner, a final, painful piece of his life she could not face. But the chrysalis demanded action. The ghost needed tools. She knelt on the rough floorboards, the chill seeping through her thin dress. The trunk itself was unremarkable, a simple oak chest containing a few of her father's less ostentatious waistcoats, a silver-handled shaving brush, a collection of maps she had studied with him as a girl. Each item was a shard of a broken world. She folded the clothes with mechanical precision, her mind not on the past but on the future, on the forging of a new self. As she lifted the last map from the bottom, her knuckles scraped against a slight unevenness in the wood. A craftsman's eye might have missed it, but her fingers, sensitized by a lifetime of tracing figures in ledgers and turning the delicate pages of books, detected the subtle discrepancy. Her breath hitched. She ran her fingertips along the seam, finding a nearly invisible catch. With a quiet click, a thin panel of wood sprang loose. Beneath it lay no lock of her mother's hair, no childhood portrait, no sentimental trinket of a life now lost. Instead, she found the ghost of a different man, one she had never known. The air left her lungs in a soft rush. This was not a father's memento for his daughter, but a strategist's archive, a single leather-bound ledger, its cover worn soft with use, and a neat packet of letters tied with a faded ribbon. Her hands trembled as she lifted the ledger. Opening it, she recognized her father's precise, economical script immediately. But these were not the sanitized figures of the company's official books. These were his private accounts, annotated with a mounting frantic suspicion. Page after page detailed discrepancies in cargo manifests, payments to unknown parties, and the gradual, deliberate devaluation of his most prized shipping routes. In the margins, next to certain transactions, he had scrawled a single damning name: Harrington. The cold stone of grief in her chest was suddenly encased in ice. She untied the packet of letters with numb fingers. The first few were in her father's hand, copies of increasingly urgent inquiries sent to his partners, his lawyers, even to the old Duke himself, all expressing his concerns about Lord Harrington's influence and the strange financial bleed affecting his assets. The replies, when they came, were dismissive, placating. They spoke of market fluctuations, of bad luck. Then came the other letters. These were not copies. They were the originals, pilfered by a desperate dying man. One was from Lord Harrington to a ship's captain, instructing him to report a fictional storm damage to a vessel carrying a fortune in Vance-owned spices. Another was a private communication between Harrington and a port official, arranging for the misplacement of a cargo of Virginia tobacco. The evidence was methodical, cold-blooded, a financial assassination plotted over years. But the final letter made the blood drain from her face entirely. It was in Lady Beatrice's elegant looping hand, addressed to Lord Harrington. "My dearest Alistair," it began, the endearment a physical blow. "The old man is nearly convinced. He believes the girl is a spendthrift, that her father's weakness of character runs in her blood. I've planted the seeds and he swallows them whole. He spoke today of his disappointment, of how the Vance legacy is too fragile to be left to a foolish girl's whims. Soon the roots will be ours, and you will have the capital to secure your own destiny, free of your cousin's shadow. Be patient, my love. A few more weeks and it will all be over." Eleanor sat back on her heels, the parchment crinkling in her white-knuckled grip. The room seemed to tilt. It wasn't just business. It wasn't just a cruel twist of fate or the Duke's flawed judgment. It was a conspiracy, a calculated personal betrayal crafted by the man who had smiled at her over the dinner table and the woman who had pretended a maternal interest. They had not merely taken her inheritance. They had murdered her father's reputation and orchestrated her social ruin to do it. His final illness had not been a coincidence. It had been the culmination of their poison. The grief did not vanish. It transformed. It was no longer a cold, passive stone, but a shard of obsidian, sharp and deadly. The truth was not a burden. It was an arsenal. Each forged document was a bullet. Each conspiratorial letter was a blade. Lord Harrington had wanted shipping routes. Lady Beatrice had wanted status and a lover unshackled from his powerful cousin. Alistair, the new Duke, had been their unwitting pawn, his pride and prejudice the perfect tools for their scheme. They had wanted her silent and erased. They had dismissed the girl with her ledgers and her Latin as a flight of fancy. A grim, terrible smile touched Eleanor's lips for the first time in weeks. A flight of fancy could soar on the thermals of revenge. A ghost could carry a weapon. She carefully, reverently placed the ledger and the letters back into their hidden compartment. She was no longer just Eleanor Vance, the forsaken ward. She was the sole inheritor of her father's battle, and she now held his standard. The chrysalis was broken. The ghost was armed. Staring at her reflection in the cracked mirror above the washstand, Eleanor allowed a cold, thin smile to touch her lips. The Duke's carelessly tossed label, Wallflower, would be his undoing. He had no idea that a wallflower sees everything, unnoticed from the periphery, its roots absorbing every secret the soil had to offer. It was time to put one of those secrets to use. That night she did not weep. Instead, she laid out her father's letters on the small, scarred table, the oil lamp casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to trace the frantic lines of the conspiracy. Her mind, once clouded by a sorrow so thick it felt like wool in her ears, was now razor-sharp, honed on the whetstone of betrayal. She would not simply reclaim her name. She would dismantle, brick by gilded brick, the lives of those who had tried to destroy it. She decided to fight, but not with hysterics or public accusations. Her weapons would be their own: secrecy, information, and the absolute arrogance that had blinded them to her potential. The first order of business was reconnaissance. The following morning, Eleanor descended the narrow stairs of her boarding house with a new purpose. Mrs. Higgins, the landlady, commented on the colour in her cheeks, mistaking the fire of vengeance for a return to health. Eleanor offered a thin, practiced smile and stepped out into the grimy London street. Her destination was not the shops, but the Inns of Court. She spent the day in the public reading room, her bonnet pulled low, poring over legal texts and property law. She needed to understand the precise mechanisms of the will's contestation, the points of leverage. She learned of timelines, of evidentiary standards for fraud, and the near impossibility of a woman with no standing challenging a duke without irrefutable public proof. It was not enough to have the truth. She had to make it undeniable. Her second foray was into the lion's den itself. Dressed in her oldest, most forgettable gown, a plain cloak hiding her features, she took a hackney coach to Mayfair. She did not approach the Harrington mansion directly. Instead, she positioned herself in the park across the street, a book open but unread on her lap. For hours she watched. She saw Lord Harrington's carriage arrive and depart, the crest on the door a splash of arrogant gold. She noted the times, the frequency of his comings and goings. More importantly, she saw Lady Beatrice emerge for her afternoon promenade, her arm linked with that of a man who was most certainly not her husband, but a prominent, married member of Parliament. Eleanor's breath caught. This was the lover unshackled mentioned in the letter. It was a valuable piece of information, a potential point of pressure. But pressure was useless without a fulcrum. The letters and the ledger were her ultimate weapons, but they were a single, volatile shot. She needed an army of smaller truths, a campaign of whispers and destabilizing facts that would make the final blow not just decisive, but inevitable. Her thoughts turned to Alistair, the new duke. Was he truly an unwitting pawn, so blinded by pride that he couldn't see the scheme he was enabling? Or was his complicity a conscious choice? She remembered the dinner a week before her father's death. Alistair, then just the heir, had been dismissive of her father's theories on new trade routes to the east, calling them quixotic. Her father had argued with a passion that bordered on feverish, his eyes bright. At the time, Eleanor had thought it was mere intellectual fervour. Now she saw it was a man fighting for his legacy, trying to convince the one person whose support could make it real. Alistair's cold public rejection had not been a simple disagreement. It was a calculated move, the final nail. He wasn't just a pawn, he was the anvil upon which her father's fate had been broken. A plan began to form, intricate and dangerous. She could not confront the conspirators directly, but she could haunt them. She could become the ghost they had tried to create. Returning to her room that evening, the scent of coal smoke and roasting chestnuts clinging to her clothes, she set to work. She cleared the small table and laid out a fresh sheet of paper. Dipping her pen in ink, she began to write. Not a letter of accusation, but a copy. She meticulously replicated the handwriting from one of Lady Beatrice's less incriminating notes, practicing the loops and flourishes until her hand ached. She was not planning forgery, but understanding. If she was to move in their world unseen, she needed to understand its language down to the very script. Next, she turned to the ledger. She began creating her own, a parallel record that cross-referenced the dates of forged entries with real events. Ship manifests from the London docks she could verify, weather reports that contradicted logged sailing dates, the simple, verifiable truth against their constructed fiction. It was slow, painstaking work, but with every entry her conviction grew. She was not just collecting evidence. She was building a monument to the truth, a fortress of facts that their lies could not topple. The days bled into a week, then two. Eleanor's life became a paradox of shadow and intense focus. By day, she was the faded, unremarkable ward, a ghost at the edge of society. By night, in the pool of lamplight in her small room, she was a general marshalling her forces. The white-hot flame of her anger had banked into the steady, relentless heat of a forge. She was tempering herself, and the weapon she was crafting was her own reclaimed life. The fight had begun not with a shout, but with the soft, determined scratch of a pen in the quiet dark. She moved through the gas-lit fog like a wisp of it herself, her focus narrowed on the two men arguing outside the chandler's shop. Their voices, sharp and guttural, carried snippets of a shipment, the Moravian and tide change at Wapping. This was new. The Moravian was a vessel not yet on her list. She committed the names and the timings to the relentless ledger of her memory, each piece a fragile shard of a plot she was only beginning to discern. Her first forays were to the coffee houses near the docks, places thick with the smells of tar, tobacco, and male ambition. She would purchase a single cup of coffee and retreat to a shadowed corner, a ledger, her own secret one, open on the table as if she were a clerk auditing accounts. The merchants and ship captains, their voices booming over the clatter of china, paid the mousy woman no mind. They spoke of Harrington's new fleet, the Ethelstan and the Circe, ships that seemed to materialize from the very fog of the Thames, their holds mysteriously full of spices and silks on their maiden voyages. Eleanor's pen would move, notating their boasts against the dates in her ledger. She heard the confusion in their voices, an undercurrent of unease. "The man's luck is uncanny," a grizzled merchant with a tobacco-stained beard muttered to his companion. "Sails through a storm that wrecks 3 other vessels, arrives not just intact, but ahead of schedule. It's as if he commands the weather itself." She did not command the weather, but she began to command a network of public information. She spent hours in the damp, quiet halls of the Royal Exchange, cross-referencing the shipping news published in the Times with the whispers from the coffee houses and the meticulously falsified entries she had memorized from Harrington's ledger. The fiction began to show its seams. Her ship, logged as undergoing refitting in Bristol on a specific date, was, according to a dockmaster's public log, she bribed a boy to copy for her, simultaneously recorded as unloading tea in London. The lie was audacious in its laziness, as if Harrington believed no one would ever think to look. Her social reconnaissance was a more delicate operation. Gaining entry to a soirée at the home of a Mrs. Wickham, a fluttery, social-climbing widow who was a distant cousin of a cousin, required every ounce of Eleanor's feigned humility. She presented herself not as a lady of quality, but as a poor, grateful relation, overwhelmed by the grandeur. The ruse worked perfectly. While the glittering throng of the Tun swirled in the center of the ballroom, a kaleidoscope of silks and gossip, Eleanor remained a fixed point near the potted ferns, her gaze a soft, unfocused blur that belied her intense concentration. It was there she identified the key players. Lord Harrington held court near the fireplace, his laughter a touch too loud, his gestures too expansive. Clustered around him were men whose faces she recognized from the financial pages, speculators and investors, their eyes alight with avarice. They were the inner circle, the beneficiaries of the fiction. But on the edges of this group she observed others. A tall, stern-faced man named Sir Robert Gable, a respected figure in the East India Company, stood with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable, but his jaw tight as Harrington boasted of his next venture. Later, Eleanor positioned herself just close enough to hear Sir Robert murmur to a companion, "The market cannot sustain this. It is not expansion. It is a fever dream. He will burn the whole system down for his own profit." Another figure of interest was Lady Clara Thorne, a sharp-eyed woman known for her acidic wit and her even sharper business acumen, a secret she kept well hidden behind a facade of frivolity. Eleanor watched as Lady Clara engaged Harrington in flirtatious banter, her laughter like the tinkling of a bell, while her eyes coolly assessed the room's reaction to him. She was a barometer of social opinion, and the pressure around Harrington, Eleanor noted, was beginning to drop. The most challenging encounter came when she found herself momentarily trapped near the refreshment table by Mr. Sterling, Harrington's weasel-faced accountant. His eyes, small and dark, swept over her with dismissive curiosity. "You are a new face," he stated, his tone implying she was an unexplained entry in a ledger. "A temporary one, sir," Eleanor murmured, her voice barely a whisper, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I'm only here through the kindness of Mrs. Wickham." "Ah," he said, the sound dripping with condescension. "Family, a complicated ledger, is it not?" He gave a thin, humorless smile before moving on, already having forgotten her. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs, not from fear, but from a cold, clarifying fury. He had spoken of people as accounts, just as he had treated her parents' lives as a line item to be expunged. In that moment, his casual cruelty solidified her resolve more than any grand conspiracy could have. Returning to her room that night, the echo of hollow laughter and the cloying scent of perfume still clinging to her clothes, she felt a profound shift. The fragments of conversation, the wary glances, the accountant's smirk, they were no longer just isolated data points. They were the threads of a tapestry she was slowly, painstakingly weaving. She lit her lamp, the flame catching the determined glint in her eyes. The ghost in the drab dress was gone. In her place sat a strategist, surrounded by the quiet arsenal of her ledgers and notes, each page a silent step deeper into the labyrinth of their deception, and one step closer to its heart. The air in Mr. Davies's office was thick with the ghosts of better cases, the scent of old paper and dust, a stark contrast to the cloying perfumes of the Harrington ball. Sunlight filtered through a grimy window, illuminated motes dancing over stacks of legal briefs that reached toward the ceiling like precarious cliffs. It was here, in this sanctuary of forgotten ambitions, that Eleanor's resolve found its architect. Her quiet inquiries, whispered to sympathetic servants and tradesmen with old grievances, had led her to this door. Mr. Alistair Davies did not rise to greet her. He remained seated behind a desk, scarred by ink and time, a man in his late 50s, whose sharp, intelligent eyes were the only feature that seemed untouched by the decay of his circumstances. His suit, though clean, was worn thin at the elbows. "Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice a dry rasp like pages turning. "Your message was intriguing and highly cryptic." Eleanor did not wait for an invitation. She sat in the worn leather chair opposite him, placing her father's ledger on the desk between them with a definitive thud. It was not the gentle placement of a plea, but the strategic positioning of a cornerstone. "I require a solicitor, Mr. Davies, but not for the drawing up of contracts or the management of an estate. I require a strategist." Davies's eyes flickered to the ledger but did not open it. "I am no longer the man for grand strategies. As you can see," he gestured vaguely at the room's shabbiness. "On the contrary," Eleanor countered, her voice steady, a far cry from the whisper she had employed with Mr. Sterling. "I believe you are the only man for this particular strategy. You were ruined by the previous Lord Harrington after you uncovered discrepancies in his Caribbean holdings. He used his influence to have you discredited, to have your clients flee. Your honor was not just tarnished, it was publicly dismantled." A muscle in Davies' jaw tightened. The wound, though old, was clearly still raw. "You are well informed for a temporary face in society. I make it my business to be." She leaned forward, her gaze locking with his. "This," she said, tapping the ledger, "is not a record of my father's failures. It is a record of his murder, orchestrated by the current Lord Harrington and executed by his weasel-faced accountant, a man named Sterling. My parents were not a failed business. They were a line item in a ledger, expunged to consolidate power and wealth." She opened the book to a page she had marked, her finger pointing to a series of entries. "See here? Payments to M. Sterling for consultancy. The dates correspond precisely with the devaluation of our assets. And here, a loan from a shell company I have traced back to a Harrington-controlled enterprise, a loan with terms designed to be impossible to meet. It was a snare, Mr. Davies, one my father, a man who believed in a handshake and a man's word, never saw coming." Davies finally picked up the ledger, his long, pale fingers tracing the columns of numbers. His eyes, initially skeptical, began to narrow with a familiar, ferocious concentration. He saw the elegant, damning logic of the financial trap, the cold precision of the ruin. "This is compelling," he admitted, his voice barely a whisper. "But it is not enough for a court. Harrington is a peer. His word against that of a disgraced solicitor and the daughter of a man declared bankrupt. We would be laughed out of London. I am not proposing a direct assault," Eleanor said, a faint, cold smile touching her lips. It was the smile of the strategist who had replaced the ghost. "I am proposing a campaign of erosion. We will not attack the fortress. We will quietly divert its water supply, sabotage its foundations, and wait for the walls to crack." She laid out her proposal not as a supplicant, but as a partner. She would be the intelligence on the inside, a seemingly insignificant cousin of Mrs. Wickham, free to observe, to listen, to gain access to household records and casual conversations. She would provide the raw data, the names, the connections, the weaknesses. "And you," she continued, "will be the architect of their legal and financial undoing. You will guide me through the labyrinth of property law and corporate charters. You will help me set traps of our own. We will find the other creditors Harrington has ruined, the other partners he has cheated. We will weave a net of such intricate, undeniable evidence that when the time is right, one single, well-placed pull will bring the entire structure down." Davies was silent for a long time, staring at Eleanor. He saw the determined glint in her eyes, the same fire that had once burned within him before it was smothered by power and privilege. He saw not a grieving girl, but an avenging spirit cloaked in drab wool. In her he saw a chance not merely for revenge, but for redemption. To reclaim the honor that had been stolen from him, to prove that the law, though it could be bent by the powerful, could still be wielded by the just. He closed the ledger with a soft, final sound. The dust in the room seemed to settle, the decision made. "An unseen partner," he murmured, the ghost of a smile on his own lips. "A guide through the traps. Very well, Miss Eleanor. You have your strategist." He reached into a drawer, pulling out a fresh sheet of paper and uncorking a bottle of ink. The scent, sharp and alive, cut through the smell of decay. "Let us begin by mapping the labyrinth. Tell me everything you know about this man, Sterling. Every word, every smirk. Accountants, in my experience, often keep their own private set of books. And that is where we will find our first thread." Eleanor chose her moment with care, spotting Mrs. Thistlethwaite holding court near the lemonade. "I do admire Lord Harrington's ambition," she confided, leaning in as if sharing a secret, "but one does wonder if the First Mercantile Bank has overextended itself. To have so much tied to a single speculative venture." She let the sentence hang, then smiled warmly and drifted away. The next day, the normally unflappable Mr. Davies reported that the notoriously cautious Baronet Fitzwilliam had abruptly postponed a significant transfer of funds, citing market volatility. The first stone had been cast, and the ripples were beginning to spread. In the days that followed, Eleanor watched the ripple effects from the periphery of drawing rooms and charity bazaars. She learned to read the subtle shifts in the financial weather. A slight hesitation before a handshake between two merchants, averted eyes at the mention of the Oriental venture, the sudden, conspicuous absence of a junior partner from Harrington's inner circle at his usual club. These were the tiny fissures she and Davies had hoped to create. Each one was a victory, a confirmation that their invisible war was underway. Her afternoons, however, belonged to the dusty, ink-scented silence of Mr. Davies's study. It had become their command post, a place where the genteel world outside was stripped away to reveal the brutal mechanics of power and debt. Maps of London were unfurled across his desk, not of streets, but of influence and obligation. Davies, with his profound, almost instinctual grasp of the law, began drawing lines of connection, creating a spider's web with Harrington at its center. "Sterling," Davies said one afternoon, his finger tapping a name he had circled repeatedly. "He is the linchpin. Harrington's personal accountant sees everything, but he is also a man with expensive tastes and a simmering resentment. He dines at clubs he cannot afford and keeps a mistress in a Chelsea terrace house. Eleanor, seated opposite him, leaned forward. "How do you know this?" "A man like Sterling leaves a trail," Davies explained, his voice a low rumble. "It is in the discrepancies. The tailor's bills paid from a minor discretionary account Harrington never audits. The lease for the Chelsea house held in the name of a defunct shell corporation, one I remember from a property dispute a decade ago. He is skimming, but carefully. He feels secure, invisible. Then we must make him feel exposed," Eleanor replied, her voice cool. "We must turn his security into a weapon." Davies nodded, a grim satisfaction in his eyes. "Precisely. We will not confront him. We will simply let him see that someone else is looking at the same books. We will manufacture a coincidence, a question from a minor creditor, a misplaced document that finds its way back to him via a suspicious third party. He will panic. A panicked man is a careless man, and a careless man makes mistakes. He may try to cover his tracks, or if he feels the net closing, he may seek to make a deal. Their strategy took shape over weeks, a patient, meticulous campaign. Eleanor provided the social intelligence, the patterns of behavior, the vulnerabilities gleaned from years of observation. She recounted Sterling's fondness for port and his habit of talking too freely after his second glass. She described his wife's social ambitions and the crushing debt of their eldest son's Cambridge expenses. Davies took these human fragments and wove them into a legal and financial framework. He identified which of Sterling's embezzlements were most easily provable, which shell corporations were most vulnerable to judicial scrutiny. One evening, as lamplight fought back the encroaching darkness of the room, Davies laid out a new plan. "It is time to widen our net. We must find the other creditors, the ones Harrington has ruined. They are scattered and broken, but their claims are the threads we will use to weave our final net." "How do we find them without alerting Harrington?" Eleanor asked, her brow furrowed in concentration. "We do not find them," Davies said, a sly smile playing on his lips. "We let them find each other. There is a pub near the commercial docks, the Mariner's Loss. It's a place for men whose fortunes have been claimed by the sea or by sharper minds on land. It will have a trusted associate, a man who owes me a favor from a long-forgotten case, frequent the establishment. He will be a fellow sufferer, a merchant who lost a shipment due to Harrington's contractual trickery. He will share his story, buy a few drinks and listen. Grievances, once given a voice, seek company." The brilliance of the plan struck Eleanor with its simplicity and cruelty. They were not just building a case. They were building a community of the wounded, a chorus of discontent that Harrington, in his lofty isolation, would never hear until it was too late. She looked at Davies, seeing the keen legal mind at work, the strategist emerging from his cocoon of bitterness. He was, as he had promised, the architect. "And what of the first tremor?" she asked. "The rumor about the bank?" Davies leaned back, steepling his fingers. "It has done its work. The ground is softened. Now we introduce the water. I have drafted a series of anonymous letters to 3 of Harrington's most skittish minor investors. The letters will not accuse. They will merely pose questions, citing public shipping registries and insurance records, suggesting slight, almost imperceptible inconsistencies in the valuation of the fleet's assets. They will wonder in the most polite and concerned terms if their investments are as secure as they have been led to believe. He slid one of the letters across the desk. The script was neat, impersonal, and the content was a masterpiece of insinuation. It was law as a stiletto, precise, sharp, and designed to leave a small, deadly wound. Eleanor felt a cold thrill, a mixture of dread and exhilaration. This was no longer a vague plan for vengeance. It was a machine, and Davies was its master engineer. She was the provider of its fuel, information, observation, the intimate knowledge of the enemy. Together, in that room that smelled of dust and determination, they were setting a labyrinthine trap, one designed not to catch a man, but to collapse an entire world around him. Lord Harrington, for a fleeting moment, felt a cold knot of doubt tighten in his stomach upon hearing the whispers. The sheer audacity of the rumors suggested a confidence in his enemies that gave him pause. But the look of haughty indignation on Lady Beatrice's face was a mirror to his own pride, and the cold fear was swiftly burned away by the heat of insult. To be questioned by such lesser beings was unthinkable, and so, with a performance of absolute conviction, they doubled their investment, borrowing heavily and hosting an extravagant ball to announce a new, even more ambitious expansion into the East Indies trade. They publicly mocked the cowardly rumors, a display of unassailable power that inadvertently shone a spotlight on the very venture Eleanor was targeting. Their supreme social standing leaving them certain they were untouchable. Eleanor watched the spectacle from the periphery, a ghost at the feast. She had secured an invitation not as herself, but as the quiet, unassuming companion of a widowed aunt of one of Davies's contacts. The Harrington ballroom was a blaze of crystal and arrogance, a calculated display of wealth meant to intimidate and reassure. Lord Harrington, his chest puffed out like a prize cock, held court near the grand fireplace, his voice booming over the string quartet as he extolled the boundless opportunities in the East. Lady Beatrice, draped in sapphires that could have fed a London parish for a year, moved through the crowd with a brittle smile, her eyes daring anyone to voice a doubt. It was a masterclass in hubris, and Eleanor documented every moment. She saw the tightness around the eyes of Sir Reginald Poole, a minor investor whose fortune was tied up in Harrington's fleet. She noted how he flinched when Harrington clapped him on the back a little too hard, proclaiming, "Reginald here knows a sure thing when he sees it. Doubled his stake just last week." Sir Reginald's weak smile did not reach his eyes. He was one of the recipients of Davies's letter. Later, in the shadowed library where a few gentlemen had retreated with their port, Eleanor lingered by the bookshelves, pretending to examine a leather-bound volume of Swift. She listened as Harrington held forth. "Anonymous letters?" he scoffed, swirling the ruby liquid in his glass. "The weapon of the gutless. If a man has a concern, let him look me in the eye and voice it. This filth about insurance records and ship valuations. It's nothing but noise from those who lack the stomach for true commerce." A portly man named Fitzroy, whose investments were rumored to be more speculative than sound, cleared his throat. "But William, the talk is spreading. The club is abuzz with it. Perhaps a show of transparency. Transparency." Harrington cut him off, his voice sharp as a whip crack. "I am not a public ledger to be perused by every nervous clerk and his ilk. My name is my bond. My standing is your assurance. To question the accounts is to question me. And I assure you, I am beyond question." The silence that followed was heavier than the velvet drapes. Eleanor saw the doubt crystallize in Fitzroy's eyes, saw the way he looked at Harrington not as a titan of industry, but as a man who might just be too proud to see the cliff edge he was approaching. The stiletto wound Davies had inflicted was not fatal, but it was festering. Harrington's refusal to even acknowledge the possibility of a flaw was, in itself, the most damning evidence against him. The following morning, Eleanor met Davies in their usual corner of the coffee house. She recounted the events of the ball, her voice low and precise. Davies listened, his expression one of grim satisfaction. "Good," he said, stirring his coffee. "His arrogance is the piston in our engine. The more he insists his word is infallible, the harder the fall when the world sees it is not." He pushed a small folded newspaper across the table. It was a shipping gazette, a publication read by merchants and insurers. He had circled a small, seemingly innocuous notice. Look, it was a report of a storm in the Atlantic, causing minor delays to several shipping lanes. One of the listed vessels was the Prosperity, a mid-sized merchantman owned by Harrington. "A storm report?" Eleanor said, unsure. "Not just a storm report," Davies corrected, a faint smile playing on his lips. "An opportunity. The Prosperity was carrying a cargo of Welsh slate, insured for its full market value. But what if the delay caused minor damage? Not enough to sink her, but enough to require repairs in Lisbon. And what if the shipping manifests, which we can access, show a discrepancy between the insured value of that slate and its actual slightly lower wholesale value? A tiny, almost negligible overvaluation. But when combined with the whispers, the anonymous letters, and Harrington's very public, very expensive doubling down, it becomes a pattern, Eleanor finished, the cold thrill returning. It ceases to be a rumor and starts to look like a method. Precisely, Davies said. We do not need a cannon to breach his walls. We need only to demonstrate that the mortar is crumbling. The investors will do the rest. Fear is a more potent force than any audit. He laid out the next phase. They would not attack Harrington directly. Instead, they would begin to assemble their chorus of the wounded. Davies had identified 3 former employees, a dismissed ship's captain who had questioned safety protocols, a clerk from the counting house let go for noticing accounting irregularities, and a dockmaster who had been forced to look the other way on overloaded cargo manifests. Davies would approach them, not as a lawyer building a case, but as a sympathetic ear, a fellow victim of Harrington's capricious power. He would share his own story, buy a few drinks, and listen. Grievances, once given a voice, seek company. Eleanor's role was to move through the higher social circles, the world of teas and charitable committees that Lady Beatrice presided over. She was to be a quiet vector of unease, a well-placed sigh, or a concerned glance when the Harrington expansion was mentioned. I so admire their boldness, she would murmur to the right person, but one does wonder if such speed is prudent. I heard the most worrying thing about insurance premiums for the Indies route. As she left the coffee house, the weight of the conspiracy felt both immense and feather-light. They were weaving a net of whispers and doubt, thread by invisible thread. Harrington, in his marble mansion, felt only the sun on his face, believing his power was absolute. He did not feel the subtle vibrations in the web he stood upon, the tremors that were growing stronger with every denial he issued, every arrogant boast he made. The machine was in motion, and its gears were turning silently, relentlessly in the shadows he refused to see. The days leading to the ball were a study in controlled tension. Eleanor moved through Lady Beatrice's world like a ghost, her smiles perfectly measured, her conversation light as air. At a garden party, she stood beside a formidable matron, Mrs. Abernathy, whose husband sat on the board of a rival shipping concern. They watched children play on the manicured lawn. Such a spectacle the Harringtons are planning, Eleanor remarked, her voice a soft conspiratorial murmur. A ball to outshine all others. One must admire their confidence, especially with so much riding on the new Indies venture. Mrs. Abernathy sniffed, her eyes sharp. Confidence or folly? My husband says the insurance syndicates are growing nervous. The rates for the Calicut route have become exorbitant overnight. It seems the underwriters have heard whispers of overloading. Rotten timbers. Eleanor allowed a carefully crafted look of concern to shadow her features. Oh, surely not. Mr. Harrington assures everyone his ships are the soundest afloat. She let the statement hang, a fragile assertion in the face of grim reality. But one does wonder. My late father always said the sea tolerates no arrogance. Meanwhile, Mr. Davies worked the darker, more pungent corners of the city. He found the dismissed ship's captain, John Riggs, in a tavern that smelled of damp wool and cheap gin. Riggs was a bear of a man, his face weathered by salt and disappointment. Davies did not speak of lawsuits or evidence. He simply bought a bottle and shared his own story of ruin, of a partnership betrayed, of a legacy stolen by Harrington's greed. He asked me to sign a false manifest. Riggs slurred, his fist tightening around his tankard. The Star of Bengal was sitting low in the water, her seams weeping. I refused. He called me a coward and put his own man, a lickspittle with no more sense than a barnacle, in my place. The ship made it, but only just. I heard they had to pump the bilges the whole way. He ruined me for caring about the lives of my crew. Davies listened, his silence a more powerful encouragement than any question. He did the same with the counting-house clerk, a nervous man who spoke of ledgers with entries that didn't quite align, and the dockmaster who described being pressured to ignore weight restrictions. Davies collected their grievances not as a lawyer, but as a fellow casualty, weaving their individual resentments into a single, strengthening cord of collective outrage. The morning of the ball dawned unnaturally bright. In the Harrington mansion, a palace of new marble and gilded mirrors, the final preparations were a frenzy of activity. Garlands of hothouse flowers were draped over banisters, and an army of servants polished the floors to a high, dangerous gloss. Harrington himself stood in the center of the grand ballroom, his chest puffed with pride. He saw only the reflection of his own success in every surface, deaf to the dissonant hum of the city beyond his walls. In a small, cluttered office that smelled of ink and dust, Eleanor and Davies faced their final, silent accomplice, a stoic man from the Lloyd's Coffee House, the epicenter of maritime news. He had no loyalty to them, only to the speed of information. For a considerable sum, he had agreed to delay the arrival of a specific packet of dispatches from the East Indies. The news of the trade agreement's collapse, the information Eleanor's father had procured with his last bit of influence, was physically present in London, sitting in a locked box. Its release was a lever they now controlled. "It is done," Davies said, his voice hollow. The weight of their conspiracy was now a physical pressure in the room. "The sell orders are placed through the Dutch intermediary. Our entire stake is against him." Eleanor looked at the promissory notes, the last remnants of her father's hidden fortune, all bet against Harrington's empire. It was an act of financial self-immolation if they failed. "And the news? It will be delivered here, to this address, at 9 o'clock tonight." Davies pointed a trembling finger at a cheap printed invitation to the Harrington ball, stolen from a caterer. "The messenger has his instructions. He is to cause a scene, to demand payment for the urgent dispatches directly from Harrington, in front of everyone." As dusk settled, Eleanor prepared for the ball. She dressed not in her usual subdued tones, but in a gown of deep, defiant crimson. She was no longer a mere vector of unease. She was a soldier, walking into the heart of the enemy's camp. Davies, in a suit that was just respectable enough to grant him entry, would be her shadow in the crowd. The Harrington mansion blazed with light, a beacon of hubris on the hill. Carriages lined the street, disgorging London's elite into the glittering foyer. The air was thick with perfume and the sound of a 40-piece orchestra. Harrington held court at the top of the grand staircase, his smile a weapon, his handshake a performance of dominance. He saw Eleanor arrive, and his eyes glinted with a patronizing triumph. He believed she had come to witness his glory, to finally submit. Eleanor moved through the throng, a splash of blood red in a sea of pastels. She exchanged pleasantries, her smile never reaching her eyes. She saw Davies standing near a pillar, his face pale but resolute. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked relentlessly towards 9. The music swelled, the laughter grew louder, and Harrington's boasts about his Indies fleet and the boundless wealth it would bring echoed through the hall. He was at the zenith of his power, the king of his own carefully constructed world. He felt the sun of admiration on his face, blind to the gathering storm. He did not feel the subtle vibrations yet, but the web was stretched to its breaking point. The first gear of the machine, silent and relentless, was already turning in the shadows, a messenger in a dusty coat pushing his way through the crowd of glittering guests, a sealed packet of doom held tight in his hand. The crimson silk of Eleanor's gown whispered against the floorboards, a sound like a banner unfurling. The dress, the color of a freshly drawn wound, was not a gamble, but a calculated uniform. As she fastened the obsidian pendant, her reflection in the wavy glass showed a woman reforged, the shadows of hardship now a sharp, unyielding resolve that settled deep within her, a quiet storm behind her eyes. "Downstairs, mister." Davies waited, fidgeting in a suit that had been meticulously brushed and aired, a garment just respectable enough to grant him entry into the lion's den without drawing undue attention. He was to be her shadow, her anchor in the swirling sea of falsehoods. "You look "Formidable, Miss Eleanor," he said, his voice a mixture of awe and trepidation. "I feel it, Davies," she replied, her voice low and steady. "Remember your role, circulate, listen, be my eyes where I cannot be. The storm is coming, but we are the ones who built it." The ride to the Harrington mansion was a silent, charged journey through a London draped in twilight. Eleanor did not look out at the passing streets. She looked inward, rehearsing the cold pleasantries, the artful dodges, the precise moment when the mask of civility would shatter. Her heart hammered not with the frantic pulse of fear, but with the cold, thrilling cadence of anticipation. This was not a plea for acceptance or a bid for forgiveness. It was a declaration of war, delivered not with a shout but with her very presence. She was returning to the scene of her humiliation, not as a victim begging for scraps, but as the architect of its ruin, the executioner stepping onto the scaffold. The Harrington mansion was a blister of light upon the hill, a beacon of hubris visible from across the city. Their carriage joined a slow-moving queue of more opulent vehicles, each disgorging London's elite into the glittering foyer. The air, as they stepped inside, was a physical assault of cloying perfume and the soaring, relentless sweep of a 40-piece orchestra. It was a world of gilded edges and brittle laughter, a world that had once been hers and had then so casually spat her out. And there he was, Alistair Harrington, at the top of the grand staircase, holding court. His smile was a polished weapon, his handshake a performance of effortless dominance. His gaze swept the room, a king surveying his subjects, and it snagged on her. For a moment his polished composure flickered. Then his eyes glinted with a patronizing, utterly predictable triumph. He believed she had come to witness his glory, to see the magnitude of what she had lost, to finally, brokenly submit. He gave a slight, condescending nod in her direction, which she acknowledged with a tilt of her head, so minuscule it was itself an insult. Eleanor moved through the throng, a splash of blood red in a sea of insipid pastels and somber blacks. Whispers trailed in her wake, a mixture of curiosity and scandalized recognition. She did not shy from them. She let them break against her like waves against a cliff. She exchanged pleasantries with faces from her past, her smile a practiced, distant curve that never reached her eyes. All the while she was acutely aware of Davies, a steady, pale-faced presence near a potted fern by a marble pillar, his resolute expression a quiet counterpoint to the surrounding frivolity. Her own focus was divided, her senses stretched taut. Part of her mind tracked the conversation, the empty words about the weather and the season's fashions. The other part was a clockwork mechanism, synchronized with the grand timepiece on the mantelpiece, its brass pendulum swinging in a relentless ticking countdown. 9 o'clock, the witching hour. Harrington's voice boomed above the din, carried on a wave of champagne and confidence. He was holding forth to a captivated circle of sycophants and investors, his chest puffed out. "The Prospero and the Endeavour are the finest vessels to ever sail from these shores," he declared, his voice dripping with magnanimous pride. "My Indies fleet represents not merely commerce, but the boundless potential of British ambition. The returns, my friends, will rewrite the ledgers of this city." He was at the zenith of his power, the sun king of his own carefully constructed world. He felt the warm glow of admiration on his face, blind to the gathering storm clouds, deaf to the subtle tremors that were beginning to vibrate through the foundations of his empire. He did not feel the first silent gear of the machine turning in the shadows, a gear personified by a messenger in a travel-stained coat, his face grim with the weight of his dispatch, pushing his way through the glittering, oblivious crowd. The man's eyes scanned the room, not for a lord or a lady, but for the one splash of defiant crimson in a sea of conformity, a sealed packet of doom held tight in his hand. The crimson silk of her gown whispered against her leg as she accepted a glass of champagne, the initial shock of her entrance settling into a tense, watchful quiet. It was in this lull that her gaze, sweeping the room, snagged on the Duke of Alistair. With an expression of bored amusement, he plucked a single, pale petal from the shoulder of his companion's coat, a petal from the very same hothouse flower she had brushed against in her grand disruptive arrival. The deliberate, dismissive flick of his fingers was a more pointed commentary than any whispered wallflower could ever be. She met his gaze across the room, a cool, knowing calm in her eyes. There was no flicker of recognition for his title, no tremor of old insecurity. Instead, there was a placid, almost detached assessment, as if she were studying a minor and slightly tedious specimen. The man on her arm was not a suitor, not a protector, but her co-conspirator, his pale, resolute expression a perfect match for her own serene mask. The confidence she projected was not a performance for the Tun's benefit, but the genuine, unshakable serenity of someone who held all the cards and was merely waiting for the right moment to play her hand. His stunned disbelief at seeing her so transformed, the set of her shoulders, the directness of her stare, the absolute absence of the cowed woman he'd once known, was the first potent taste of her victory, a sweet, sharp flavor on her tongue. She gave Davies's arm a subtle, almost imperceptible pressure, a signal understood only by them. He released her, melting back toward a potted fern by a marble pillar, becoming a steady, watchful presence in the periphery. She, in turn, glided into the social current, a solitary ship of war, flying a crimson flag. She exchanged pleasantries, her smile a practiced, distant curve that never reached her eyes, all the while acutely aware of the grand timepiece on the mantelpiece. Its brass pendulum swung in a relentless, ticking countdown, a metronome for the impending ruin. 9 o'clock, the witching hour. Across the room, Harrington's voice boomed above the din, carried on a wave of champagne and unearned confidence. He was holding forth to a captivated circle of sycophants and investors, his chest puffed out like a strutting cock. The Prospero and the Endeavour are the finest vessels to ever sail from these shores, he declared, his voice dripping with magnanimous pride. My Indies fleet represents not merely commerce, but the boundless potential of British ambition. The returns, my friends, will rewrite the ledgers of this city. He was at the zenith of his power, the sun king of his own carefully constructed world, feeling the warm glow of admiration on his face, blind and deaf to the subtle tremors vibrating through the foundations of his empire. He did not feel the first silent gear of the machine turning in the shadows. The gear was personified by a messenger in a travel-stained coat, his face grim with the weight of his dispatch, pushing his way through the glittering, oblivious crowd. The man's eyes scanned the room, not for a lord or a lady, but for the one splash of defiant crimson. He moved with a jarring urgency, his boots leaving faint marks on the polished floor, his presence an affront to the curated perfection of the evening. He was a splash of mud on a pristine canvas. She saw him the moment he entered, her clockwork mind noting his arrival with a quiet, final click. As the messenger weaved through the throng, a path seemed to clear for him, not out of courtesy, but from an instinctual recoiling from his palpable distress. He stopped, not before Harrington, who was still pontificating about maritime tonnage, but before her. A hush, small at first but rapidly expanding, fell over their immediate vicinity. All eyes were on the travel-stained man and the woman in red. "For you, my lady," the man said, his voice rough from the road, and he thrust the sealed packet into her hands. It was heavy, the parchment thick and official. Harrington, noticing the sudden shift in attention, paused his oration. His brow furrowed in annoyance at the interruption. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, his voice cutting through the silence. "This is a private gathering." She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the packet, her fingers tracing the wax seal, a crest she knew belonged to a major trading consortium in Antwerp. With a deliberate slowness that was itself a weapon, she broke the seal. The crack of the wax was unnaturally loud in the quiet. She unfolded the document, her eyes scanning the lines of precise, damning script. Then she lifted her head, her eyes finding Harrington's, across the suddenly vast space of the ballroom. The cool calm in them had now sharpened into something lethal. "It would seem, Lord Harrington," she said, her voice clear and carrying, devoid of hysteria, a simple statement of fact, "that your boundless ambition has run aground. The Prospero and the Endeavour were caught in a squall off the Azores. Their cargo, the entirety of your leveraged investment, is at the bottom of the Atlantic. The silence that followed was absolute, a physical weight pressing down on the assembled guests." Harrington's face went from flush to a ghastly white. "You lie," he choked out, but the words were weak, stripped of all their former power. "The consortium expresses its profound disappointment," she continued, folding the letter with a crisp, final motion, "and calls in all outstanding notes immediately." She let her gaze sweep over the stunned faces of the investors, the sycophants now frozen in horror. "It appears the only thing being rewritten tonight, my lord, is your obituary." The first gear had turned. The machine of his ruin was now in motion, and she was its calm, unstoppable engineer. The whispers began again, but this time they were not about her. They were the sound of an empire cracking apart, and at the center of the cataclysm she stood, serene and untouchable in her victory red. The final, shocking revelation, delivered by a rival lord who had despised Harrington for years, with a relish he no longer bothered to conceal, landed not with a whisper, but with the force of a headsman's axe. The mysterious investor who had bet against him, profiting immensely from his downfall, was connected to an old Vance family solicitor. The name Vance hung in the air, a ghost summoned from a past everyone had worked so diligently to forget. Every head in the room, as if pulled by a single taut string, turned toward the one person connected to that name, Lady Eleanor Vance. She did not flinch. She did not lower her eyes. She simply stood there, a statue carved from victory red and cool marble, allowing the collective gaze to wash over her. The silence was no longer heavy. It was electric, a live wire of shared comprehension. The serene smile she had worn all evening did not widen, but it deepened, transforming from a mask of social grace into the true, sharp expression of a predator witnessing the trap snap shut. Lord Harrington's eyes, wide with a dawning horrific understanding, found hers. The ghastly white of his face now took on a grey, corpse-like hue. "You," he breathed, the single word a ruin in itself. "It was you." Eleanor took a single, deliberate step forward, the rustle of her silk gown the only sound in the cavernous room. "The Vance family had many assets, my lord," she said, her voice carrying with the clarity of a bell. "My father's love for antiquities was public. His acumen for investment, however, was a more private affair. He believed in diversifying, a lesson you, in your singular focus on spice and tea, so clearly failed to learn." She let that settle, watching as the investors and sycophants who had minutes ago hung on Harrington's every word now took subtle steps back, physically distancing themselves from the contagion of his failure. They were a flock of starlings, shifting direction as one, their allegiance turning with the wind. The solicitor, Mr. Abernathy, was instructed to manage a discretionary fund, she continued, her gaze sweeping over the crowd, making them all witnesses to her accounting. "A fund specifically designed to act as a safeguard against volatile market conditions, or in this case, volatile men. When I returned to London, it was not, as some whispered, to find a husband from the wreckage of my family's name. It was to access that fund and to execute a single, specific instruction my father had the foresight to put in place." Harrington took a stumbling step backward, his hand groping for the back of a nearby chair for support. The structure of his power, so seemingly solid, was not just cracked. It was dissolving into dust around him. "Abernathy would never." "Without my knowledge." "Mr. Abernathy serves the Vance estate, Lord Harrington," Eleanor interrupted, her tone gently corrective, as if speaking to a slow child. "Not your personal ambitions. He provided the capital. I merely provided the intelligence. I knew your habits, your tells. I knew you would over-leverage on the Prospero and the Endeavour. I knew you saw the East Indies deal as your crowning glory. It was not difficult to see the house of cards for what it was. I simply chose to blow it down." The admission was breathtaking in its audacity. This was not the act of a grieving daughter. This was a calculated financial assassination. The whispers that now broke out were no longer about a fallen man, but about the woman who had felled him. They were laced with a new, potent mixture of fear and respect. Then the final piece of her vengeance slid into place. From the periphery, a man emerged, tall, somberly dressed, his face a familiar one in the circles of finance. It was Mr. Thistlethwaite, the chief clerk of Harrington's primary bank. He did not look at the ruined lord. Instead, he walked directly to Eleanor and gave a short, respectful bow. "My lady," he said, his voice firm, "as per the covenants of the notes now held by the Vance Discretionary Trust, we are required to seize the assets pledged as collateral." "Effective immediately," Eleanor gave a slight, regal nod. "Proceed, Mr. Thistlethwaite." It was this, more than the loss of the ships, more than the public humiliation, that broke Harrington. His homes, his lands, the tangible manifestations of his status, all were being stripped from him in a single declarative sentence. A raw animal sound tore from his throat. He lunged, not at Eleanor, but at the nearest object, a priceless Sèvres vase on a pedestal. He seized it and hurled it to the floor, where it exploded into 1,000 shimmering fragments. The collective gasp was sharp, but Eleanor did not even blink. She watched the porcelain dust settle, then lifted her eyes to meet his frantic ones. "Shattering the trinkets won't save the estate, Robert," she said, and the use of his Christian name was the final, intimate blow. "It only makes the cleaning more tedious." She then turned her back on him. It was the ultimate dismissal. The show was over. She began to walk, slowly and purposefully, toward the grand entrance of the ballroom. The crowd parted before her, a red sea of silk and awe. No one reached out. No one spoke to her. They simply watched her pass, this avenging angel in crimson, the architect of the night's cataclysm. At the doorway, she paused and glanced back, not at Harrington, who was now being physically restrained by 2 other lords, but at the portrait of him that hung proudly over the mantelpiece. Her eyes met the painted, arrogant gaze of the man he had been just an hour before. Then she was gone. The silence she left in her wake was absolute, broken only by the ragged, broken breaths of the man whose empire was now just a memory, and the first tentative notes of the orchestra, foolishly attempting to restart the music for a party that had already ended. The checkmate was absolute. Lord Harrington, facing debtor's prison, attempted to publicly accuse her, his voice a strangled, desperate thing that clawed at the hushed air. She is the architect of this, a spider who has spun her web from the shadows." But his panicked, rambling tirade, devoid of the elegant venom he was known for, only made him look pathetic, a cornered animal bearing broken teeth. The crowd, which had once hung on his every bon mot, now watched with a kind of horrified pity, their faces a gallery of withdrawn favor. It was then that Mr. Davies calmly stepped forward, his movements a study in quiet efficiency against Harrington's flailing ruin. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The silence itself leaned in to listen. He presented preliminary evidence, a letter of agreement with a forged signature, a ledger entry in Harrington's own hand that contradicted his public accounts, a mere taste of the fraud the man had perpetrated against her late father. Davies promised a full, public legal battle, his words not a threat, but a simple, inexorable statement of fact, like the reading of a sentence already passed. The law, which Harrington had always believed was a tool for men like him, now showed him its cold, impartial face. Near the grand marble column, where she had held court all evening, Lady Beatrice let out a small, choked sound. The social standing she had guarded with such vicious precision, the pedestal from which she had judged all of London, was incinerated in the instant her husband was revealed as not just a ruin, but a criminal. The whispers that now swirled around her were not of envy, but of delicious scandal. The glittering world she had ruled was a pane of glass, and Eleanor had driven a hammer through its center. Her eyes, wide with uncomprehending horror, rolled back as her legs gave way. She fainted, a slow, graceful collapse of silk and shame into a crowd of onlookers who subtly, almost imperceptibly, shifted their weight away. Not a single hand reached out to break her fall. She landed in an ungainly heap on the polished floor, a monument to abandoned allegiance. Eleanor watched the edifice of their arrogance crumble into dust, her expression unreadable, a still lake over unfathomable depths. There was no triumph in her gaze, no smirk of victory. There was only the quiet hum of a complex mechanism that had performed its final, precise function. She had not only reclaimed her fortune tenfold, securing not just her father's original stake, but every pound of interest and punitive damages the law would allow. But she had orchestrated their complete and public humiliation, using their own greed against them. They had built the stage, chosen the music, and invited the audience. She had merely provided the final tragic act. As the stunned guests began to murmur, their voices rising like a tide of shocked speculation, Eleanor turned. Her work here was done. She moved through the crowd, which parted for her as if she emitted a force field. The crimson of her gown, once a bold declaration, was now the color of a concluded hunt. She did not look back at Harrington, now slumped and broken, being spoken to in low, serious tones by men who were suddenly his creditors and accusers. She did not glance at the prostrate form of Lady Beatrice, being half-heartedly fanned by a reluctant matron. Her focus was already elsewhere, beyond the gilded cage of the ballroom. She exited onto the grand staircase, the cool night air a welcome balm, after the stifling heat of so much collective emotion. Below, her carriage waited, a sleek black contraption that seemed to absorb the flickering torchlight. As she descended, a figure detached itself from the shadows near the gate. It was Mr. Thistlethwaite, his sharp avian features softened by the gloom. He fell into step beside her, matching her pace without a word. Once inside the plush confines of the carriage, the door shut against the world, he finally spoke. "It is done, then." "It is done," Eleanor confirmed, her voice flat, drained of the vibrant, cutting energy she had wielded like a scalpel all evening. She stared out the window as the carriage lurched into motion, watching the Harrington mansion, a blazing jewel of opulence, recede into the past. "There will be repercussions," Thistlethwaite said, not as a warning but as a strategist stating the next variable. "The Harringtons are broken, but they have allies. Frightened, cornered allies." "Let them be frightened," Eleanor replied, her breath misting the cool glass of the window. "A frightened enemy is a predictable one. They will scuttle to protect their own interests, not avenge the Harringtons. The battle is won. The war of perception, however, begins tomorrow. And the artifact?" he asked, his voice dropping even though they were utterly alone. Eleanor's hand went to the small velvet bag that rested on the seat beside her. Inside was not a jewel or a document, but the heavy, cool weight of the Sèvres vase's largest remaining shard, a curved piece of porcelain still bearing a single, perfectly painted blue flower. She had retrieved it herself from the ballroom floor, in the moment after Harrington had been dragged away, a final, tangible piece of his ruin. "A reminder, Mr. Thistlethwaite," she said, her fingers tracing the smooth, broken edge. "Not of his failure, but of the nature of power. It is as fragile as porcelain, and those who wield it like a cudgel will always be surprised when it shatters in their hands." She let the shard fall back into the bag, the soft thud a full stop to the evening's narrative. "See that the preliminary documents are filed with the court at first light. I want no room for him to breathe." As the carriage carried her away from the wreckage, Eleanor allowed her mask to slip completely. The avenging angel was gone. In her place sat a woman, profoundly tired, staring into the London night, the weight of a reconstructed future settling on her shoulders. The victory was absolute, but the silence within her was not peaceful. It was the quiet of a field after a battle, empty, echoing, and strewn with the consequences of absolute victory. The silence that stretched after Harrington's final, humbled retreat was more profound than any sound. It was in that quiet that the Duke found her, his approach deliberate, his expression a familiar, hardened mask. He did not speak, but the resentment in his eyes was a cold compress on an old, faded scar. It brought no healing, only the sting of a truth he was not yet ready to concede. Eleanor met his gaze, then turned away, the victory complete and entirely her own. "You have nothing to say that I need to hear, Alistair," she said, her voice devoid of the triumph he clearly expected. It was flat, factual, like a ledger entry. "Your understanding, however belated, is your own business. Do not mistake my silence for forgiveness. It is merely a lack of interest." He flinched as if struck. This was not the script he had prepared for in the carriage ride over, a journey fueled by frantic guilt and a desperate need for catharsis. He had envisioned tears, perhaps, or a righteous fury that would allow him to play the penitent. He had not envisioned this administrative dismissal. He saw now that the woman before him was not the girl he had jilted. That girl was a ghost, and the space she had occupied was now filled with a formidable and immovable reality. "I was a fool," he whispered, the confession meant for her but spoken to the floor. "Yes," Eleanor agreed, not unkindly, but without an ounce of solace. "You were. A fool who allowed himself to be a pawn for lesser men. The tragedy is not that you wronged me, Alistair. The tragedy is that you believed yourself a player in a game when you were merely a piece on their board. A gilded piece, to be sure, but a piece nonetheless." She turned from him then, a deliberate and final movement. The audience was over. Her gaze swept across the thinning crowd, noting the averted eyes, the hushed conversations that died as she passed. She was no longer just Eleanor. She was the woman who had broken the Harrington name in a single evening. She was a force of nature, and they were all calculating the direction of the gale. Her butler, Thistlethwaite, materialized at her elbow, a stoic rock in the shifting sea of silk and shame. "The carriage is ready, madam, and Mr. Sterling from the London Chronicle awaits in your study. He claims to have an appointment." A ghost of a smile, the first genuine expression all evening, touched her lips. "Of course he does. See that the Duke finds his way out. I have a war of perception to begin." Leaving Alistair standing alone in the grand foyer, a monument to his own irrelevance, she moved toward the stairs. Her body ached with a fatigue that was bone-deep, a residue of the performance she had just concluded. The avenging angel's armor was heavy, and she longed to be free of it. In her study, the air was thick with the scent of beeswax and old paper. Mr. Sterling, a lean man with ink-stained fingers and the keen eyes of a predator, rose from his chair. He did not bow. He assessed. "Mrs. Eleanor," he said, his voice a low rasp, "you promised me a story." "I promised you the truth, Mr. Sterling," she corrected, settling behind her mahogany desk. She did not reach for the velvet bag containing the porcelain shard, but she was acutely aware of its presence in the top drawer, a cold, hard secret. A commodity far more valuable and far more dangerous. She slid a slim folder across the polished wood. "Inside, you will find notarized copies of the financial transfers from the Harrington accounts to certain influential parties within the city's licensing and regulatory bodies. You will also find affidavits from 3 merchants whose businesses were deliberately suppressed after they refused Harrington's investment offers." Sterling opened the folder, his eyes scanning the documents with practiced speed. He let out a low whistle. "This is more than a social scandal. This is a blueprint for systemic corruption." "Precisely," Eleanor said, leaning forward, her elbows on the desk, her fingers steepled. "The ballroom drama was the spark. This," she tapped the folder, "is the kindling. I do not want a tawdry tale of a fallen lord. I want a narrative of justice, of a corrupt edifice being dismantled by the very ones he sought to crush. You will paint him not as a tragic figure, but as a venal one. You will paint his allies as complicit. And you will paint me," she paused, her gaze unwavering, "as a reluctant public servant, compelled to act for the good of the city." Sterling looked at her, a new kind of respect dawning in his expression. He dealt in truths, but she dealt in the architecture of reality itself. "They will call you a viper, a social climber with a vendetta. Let them," Eleanor replied, echoing her words to Thistlethwaite from the night before. A frightened enemy is a predictable one, and I would rather be a viper than a lamb led to the slaughter. The article runs tomorrow. The full front page. After Sterling had left, the silence of the house descended once more. It was different from the quiet of the carriage. This was the silence of a command center after the orders have been given. The battle was joined on a new front. She walked to the window looking out at the London night. The gas lamps flickered, creating islands of light in a sea of darkness. Somewhere out there, Harrington was in a cell. His allies were scrambling, and Alistair was nursing his shattered pride. She thought of the porcelain shard in her drawer. Fragile as porcelain, the Harringtons of the world believed power was a hammer. They never understood it was a scalpel. It was not about brute force, but about precision, about knowing exactly where to cut to make the whole structure fall. A profound loneliness, cold and clear, washed over her. This was the weight of a reconstructed future. It was built on the rubble of her old life, and the landscape was desolate. There was no one to share this victory with, no hand to hold in the quiet aftermath. The hollow pity she had felt for Alistair was now a hollow space within herself. She had won everything, and in doing so had confirmed her absolute solitude. The war was won, but the peace felt like exile. Weeks later, Eleanor stood on the balcony of the London townhouse, her fingers resting on the cool stone balustrade that had once framed a ghost of herself. The same stones, the same square below, but the woman looking down was now the architect. She held her father's ledger, its worn leather cool against her palm. It was no longer a testament of failure, but a blueprint of her own ascent. From ruin to redemption, yes, but the redemption was not for the woman she had been. It was for the architect she had become. The financial world, a club of staid gentlemen, had initially bristled at her presence, though they accorded her a respect laced with a healthy, calculating fear. She was not a curiosity. She was a force. Inside, on a mahogany desk that had once been Harrington's, rested a stack of correspondence. The most recent, bearing the ducal seal, remained unopened. The Duke's letters had become a weekly ritual, each more sincere and pleading than the last, echoing through the days following the ballroom confrontation. In them he spoke of deep regret, of shattered illusions about his nephew, of the hollow victory of his own preserved status. He begged for a chance, not to explain, but to earn her forgiveness. She had read the first few, her heart then a placid lake untouched by the stones he threw. Now, weeks later, she often left them there for days, a silent testament to where they ranked in her new priorities. The chapter with him was closed, its final sentence written the night she reclaimed her own narrative. Reopening it would be a sentimental indulgence, and sentimentality was a currency she no longer traded in. Her butler, a severe and efficient man she had poached from a disgraced viscount, entered the study. "Mr. Sterling to see you, my lady. He insists he does not have an appointment." A faint smile touched her lips. "Show him in." Sterling entered with the same contained energy she remembered, his gaze sharp, missing nothing. He took in the room. The subtle redecoration that had erased Harrington's ostentatious taste, the strategic placement of her own few but significant acquisitions. His eyes lingered on the ledger in her hand. "I see you still carry a Bible," he remarked, his tone dry. "A reminder of the cost of things," Eleanor replied, setting it down on the desk. "To what do I owe the pleasure, Mr. Sterling? Has your editor finally tired of your inconvenient dedication to the truth?" "On the contrary. The Viper of Mayfair sells papers." He said the moniker without flinching, a statement of fact. "But that is not why I'm here. I come with a warning." Eleanor gestured for him to continue, her posture unchanged. Warnings were now a common feature of her landscape. "Harrington is out," Sterling said bluntly. "His allies managed to untangle the mess you created. The formal charges didn't stick. He's lost a great deal of face and a not insignificant portion of his capital, but he is a free man." She had expected this. The old structures were resilient. "I am aware he's been making inquiries. About you, about your new ventures. He's not shouting his rage from the rooftops. He's being quiet about it, methodical. "A frightened enemy is a predictable one," Eleanor quoted her own words back to him, the mantra that had steadied her in the silent aftermath of her victory. "And a hammer, once its nature is known, is easily avoided." Sterling shook his head, a glimmer of that dawning respect returning to his eyes. "You reconstructed his reality once. He won't risk you doing it again. He won't come at you like a hammer. He'll try to find a scalpel of his own." After Sterling left, the silence of the townhouse settled around her. It was different from the profound loneliness of the night after the article had run. That had been the silence of a battlefield after the cannons fell silent, a desolate peace. This was the active, humming quiet of a command post anticipating the next move. The war was not over. It had merely evolved. Sterling's final words coiled in the stillness. Harrington wasn't just gathering dirt, he was buying influence, and his first target was the very committee overseeing her father's shipping contracts. He wasn't aiming for a scandal in the press, but for a quiet, legal annihilation. She walked back to the balcony, the ledger forgotten on the desk. The Duke's unopened letter was a relic of a past life, a life where her battles were personal, fought in ballrooms and over teacups. Harrington's imminent threat was of a different nature, a professional, financial one. It was a game on a board she now understood intimately. The gas lamps below began to flicker on, pushing back the encroaching dusk. They created islands of light, just as they had that night weeks ago, but she no longer felt adrift in the sea of darkness between them. She was the architect of those islands now. She had felt the weight of a reconstructed future, the desolation of a victory that felt like exile. But in that exile, she had found a formidable kind of freedom. There was no one's hand to hold, no approval to seek, no role to play, except the one she wrote for herself. The chapter with Alistair was closed. The chapter with Harrington was being written in real time, a complex treatise on power and consequence. But the new one, the one she was authoring entirely on her own terms, was just beginning. It was a story not of revenge or even redemption, but of pure, unadulterated creation. And as she looked out at her city, feeling the cool evening air on her skin, she felt not the cold of loneliness, but the thrilling chill of absolute possibility. For the first time, she was truly free, and her freedom was the sharpest scalpel of all.